Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Into the Bytecode. Today, I sat down with my good friend, Josh Stark. Josh has a long history in the Ethereum ecosystem. Going back to the early days of the community, he co-founded and worked on one of the very first Layer 2 scaling protocols with Counterfactual. He also co-founded ETHGlobal, which is a much-loved series of hackathons and events that brings the community together and which acts as an entry point into the ecosystem for many people. And nowadays, and most relevant to our conversation, he works in a leadership capacity at the Ethereum Foundation. So in this conversation, we talked about two topics. One being the Ethereum Foundation, or the EF, how it operates, what it's actually like to work there, how it thinks about what to prioritize. And two, we dig into the question of why blockchains matter in the first place, which is something Josh has spent a lot of time thinking about and which he's written about in a long-form piece titled Atoms, Institutions, and Blockchains. And so without further ado, I'll leave you to it.
EF is a community of teams. Its broad mandate is to support the Ethereum ecosystem. And there's kind of three principles that we talk about a lot that really inform, where we work and why we work. And those three are as follows. One, long-term thinking. We are not especially interested in, short-term narratives or market cycles. We are interested in the things that are going to matter, years, decades into the future. Secondly, this idea of subtraction, which, we've talked about publicly a lot. And, I has given many presentations about it. Albert, who used to work at the EF, has given talks about it as well. And the idea here, to sum up a complex idea, is that, we are not trying to grow as an organization for its own sake. We are not trying to accumulate things, whether that be money or prestige or power. We are trying to, reduce our overall impact in the ecosystem over the long term by helping everything outside of us grow stronger. And so that influences a lot of what we do and don't do, and is really foundational for, a lot of the things that we quite intentionally choose not to do. And then the third thing is, what we call stewardship of values. We aren't and we can't be agnostic to the values of the Ethereum ecosystem and the values of the protocol. I think it would be a mistake to think of Ethereum or really any blockchain merely as a technology. These things are technology paired with ideologies, with movements, with communities of people who hold values and express those values and act on them. So, it's not our role to decide what the values of the ecosystem are. That's up to, all the individual people and organizations who choose to be part of it. But we do see it our responsibility to, try and nudge things in a positive direction, to balance maybe what naturally occurs and what gets the most attention in the ecosystem, and remind people that this is a very big tent that includes a lot of different values, different people, different organizations.
Right. And there's so much there to unpack. Maybe on this, on this point of subtraction, there's been this analogy that I personally find helpful in thinking about this, and it's in drawing a parallel between Ethereum and the arc of the internet and how it evolved, right? And thinking about the fact that at the very beginning, at t=0, let's say the internet started out as a P2P network between 4 universities that had hooked up this network, and each of them played a very important role in keeping this network up and running, both at the technical level, but also at the level of this is actually a thing that, the world should care about, and talking about it and moving it forward. And over time, the internet kind of grows and grows and grows, where today it's this just kind of fabric that's woven into the world. And it's almost absurd to think about one company or one organization being critical to the functioning of the internet, right? There's no org that you could knock out and it would bring down the internet. And, there's some distribution of there's certain orgs that have more of a influence in the infrastructure, how things are hooked up. But at a global level, it's decentralized and resilient to those types of things at this point. And when I think about Ethereum, like when Ethereum was started, right, the Ethereum Foundation was kind of this original organization that was helping get everything off the ground, right? So it was developing the very first client, which is Geth. It was developing the programming language. It was running the only event that brought people together with DevCon. And as time progresses forward, there's more and more organizations who enter this arena where today you look at Ethereum and it's, Ethereum does not equal to the Ethereum Foundation at all, right? Like there's hundreds, thousands of companies, nonprofits, people contributing to this thing around the world. And we're almost at this point where you could, almost like remove the EF and Ethereum would continue fine. Now there's still like a few pieces, like few critical things that the EF is contributing to, like ETH2, like, certain things would take a hit. But I think the trajectory of this thing is that at some point in the future, this network, this community is completely self-sustaining. And so if you overlay this on the like strategy of the Ethereum Foundation, it basically wants to push power and responsibility and all of these things to this ecosystem in a way that like it makes itself less of a pillar, less of a critical node over time. So it's trying to decrease its own relative significance by increasing the significance of like all of the larger ecosystem and all the players that are involved in it. And that's like, that to me is like one way to think about this idea of subtraction. And I just find that to be a very, very like beautiful idea.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. Maybe there's kind of two interesting areas to expand there. One is maybe like a helpful metaphor that we talk about a lot, which is that, we talk about the EF being a gardener,
Right.
or maybe like a, someone helping to grow an ecosystem. And in order to, enable an ecosystem to grow, you can't plan every detail out of it. If you believed you could plan or control every detail out of it, then what you would be building is not really an ecosystem. I know ecosystems need to be able to have pieces removed and still function. They need to be able to grow and change in response to changing conditions. And having, one entity try and control all that, it's never going to work, right? This is maybe like an analog of the principle that any complex system inevitably grew out of a simpler system that also worked on its own. And if what you're trying to grow or enable in some way is a complex organism that is decentralized and self-sufficient and sustainable, you can't really start that off, from a very centralized command economy controlled way, because, at some point you're going to have to pull off the training wheels and the thing's going to fall apart. So I think the Ethereum community from the very beginning has understood that and believed that, the training wheels need to come off virtually immediately. And that can be frustrating to people who don't have maybe the vantage point that we do, or who are very concerned about a short-term trajectory. But again, the long-term view here is what we care about. If Ethereum succeeds for 10 years and then fails forever, that's failure. That's not a success by any metric that I would care about. So long-term success is the only game in town, and so that's what we're optimizing for.
Yeah. When you say it's like virtually from the beginning, this was happening, like I'm curious if you look back over the arc of the Ethereum ecosystem, are there specific points that you see as like these were instances where an additional like layer of decentralization was introduced into the ecosystem, right? Like, I mean, as a very recent example of this, I think the fact that there are multiple ETH2 clients and all of them are basically independent organizations, that EF doesn't actually have an ETH2 clients team. That to me is like a beautiful kind of instantiation of this idea. But I'm curious, like looking back, do you see other cases where you kind of noticed that this was happening?
I mean, I think that we can't talk about this without talking about consensus, right? The
Right.
fact that there was another very committed and well-capitalized organization very early in Ethereum's history, who were willing to, spend and try experiments and get things right and get things wrong, was a major contributor to kind of proving the point that it was not just the EF's job
Totally.
to do things. And out of that, you get a lot of projects that spin out of consensus that, kind of form their own ecosystems and, go on to spin things out in turn. But that was definitely a notable one early on. I think the ETH2 client is a great example. I think something similar is happening now with the development of layer 2 protocols, right?
Yeah.
Where you have these multiple credible, successful organizations who are building different solutions, who will be, major components of the Ethereum ecosystem, who are well positioned to bring on users and attract applications and be a very kind of like user and developer facing interface. I think that's a huge step forward. Completely aside from the benefits of layer 2 itself, just the fact that there are all these multiple organizations who will compete with each other and collaborate with each other is a very notable milestone in this overall story of the growth of the ecosystem. Another
Yeah.
one that happened recently, I don't know the exact date, but maybe I should figure this out. But 3 years ago, when people looked at who was spending money in the Ethereum ecosystem and who was providing grant money for public goods,
Yeah.
the EF kind of stood above everyone else just in terms of the amount of capital being deployed and the amount of capital being available. But now, if you look at the top 10 DAO treasuries, the EF is a pretty small organization
Yeah.
compared to all these other DAOs that exist now and are trying to figure out for themselves, what is our mandate? How do we allocate funding effectively to the ecosystem? How do we collaborate with each other? The story today is very different from 3 years ago, 6 years ago, longer than that.
Totally. Yeah, like looking at the Gitcoin grants rounds and seeing who was contributing to the matching pool, you can kind of like see the decentralization of public goods funding on a timeline, basically. On this question of layer 2s, like fast forward, 3 to 5 years, how do you actually define what the Ethereum ecosystem is? And like, what do you think the world will look like? Because I like my kind of mental model of this is that the Ethereum mainnet will increasingly be used by rollups as a data availability layer, right? And more applications and users will just be deployed on these layer 2s and interfacing with these layer 2s. And so I think there's just an interesting question about, like, let's say 10 years into the future, is Ethereum even known as like a consumer level brand, right? Like, do individual people in the world even know about Ethereum, or is it these rollups that they know about? And Ethereum is really just this infrastructural like settlement layer that brings security to the whole thing. How do you think about that?
Yeah, I have a relatively strong view on this, which is that I think it's actually really important that the Ethereum brand name, whatever, be visible to users of rollups, where those rollups depend on Ethereum for its security. At the end of the day, like the fundamental thing that blockchains like Ethereum provide is security, or as we'll talk about later, hardness. This idea
Right.
that if you own an asset, you really do own it, and the network can't be kind of compromised from a well-financed attacker, or the project that is properly non-custodial can't take your money, et cetera, et cetera. And at a base level, all of the things that make that possible are kind of have their root at Ethereum itself.
Right.
And so if people don't understand where that security is coming from, then I think they won't be able to make informed choices, right? If a user only understands that they're using rollup X, and that rollup decides at some point to swap using Ethereum for some other relatively insecure L1 that paid them a lot of money to migrate, they can't really not explain that to their users when
Right.
the basic property of what they have, whether that be owning some crypto or an NFT or using a marketplace on the rollup, has fundamentally changed. It is like a critical part of the product at the end of the day. And I do worry about a situation where this does become obscure to users. It would create a kind of, systemic risk where people are not able to adjust their choices as the reality under their feet is shifting. If,
Yeah.
some other L1 is being swapped in, people need to understand fundamentally what they're actually buying. And of course, this is all on chain. We can see it. People are able to confirm for themselves, what is this rollup anchored to? But I think that's only part of the story, right? We can't rely on every single person, eventually billions and billions of humans to, know how to validate something from, running their own node and their own on-chain data. They need an application to tell them this. There needs to be like a cultural expectation that it is normal and expected to be clear about these things. Like, we need the kind of information economy around helping users make these choices to actually match up to what the reality is.
Right. It sounds like almost more of a behavioral, like social layer question than a technical one, right?
To me, like, those aren't different questions, right?
Right.
I think like a key thing that a general type of mistake I think people make in thinking of blockchains is, this classic scenario of the comp sci professor from Berkeley only views
Right.
them through a computer science lens. The finance person only views it as a market. The video game person only views it as like a weird in-game economy that doesn't quite work, whatever it happens to be. But another version of that kind of mistake, I think, is to view this as something distinct from the social layer stuff. Blockchains are a social technology. They enable social coordination. If people don't understand them or be able to relate to each other about them, then they're kind of meaningless, right? If people don't believe that blockchains work, then they're not going to use them. And that relationship that people have to it is pretty fundamental to the whole thing.
Yeah. How do you sense make out of the way people currently understand and like interface with blockchains, right? Because I think even today, like it's like anyone who's actually using crypto today is still somewhat of an early adopter, I would say. Like it's still like pretty hard to, I don't know, like use MetaMask and like transfer like crypto from an exchange to your wallet and use Etherscan, and like all the stuff is like still pretty janky. So like I think the people who are in the ecosystem in any way at all are pretty sophisticated on a relative scale. And I already feel like this question of like, okay, like how decentralized or how, whatever the blockchain is, or like the particular protocol that you're using on a particular blockchain, like these questions are just completely mired in just opinion, right? It's like very hard to understand what the hell is going on unless you like go and try to make sense of it yourself, which not everyone can, not everyone has the time to. Yeah, how do you think about what's happening already in this space and how it projects into the future, and like what needs to change to make some of this go in a better direction?
It's a very big question.
We're here for the big questions.
Here for the big questions, yeah. I definitely think that one of the most underappreciated or underhyped priorities for crypto as a whole is explaining to people how it works. And people obviously care about that, but I think most people don't appreciate how like critical and like absolutely critical path that is. Again, if people don't understand anything about what this is or how it works, and all they're doing is clicking buttons on a website without any sort of appreciation for why this is different than clicking buttons on facebook.com, then we're failing. Then I don't think we really achieved anything. This needs to include educating users and helping them understand what the political choice is essentially that they're making when they're using an application that is, secured by an open blockchain like Ethereum versus when they're using an application that is just, going into Facebook's or Meta's backend somewhere. And I think right now we're not doing a great job at that. And there's lots of different, perspectives on this. It's not just about, understanding, how proof of stake works or, what a smart contract is. It's lots of different pieces of this. One that I love to complain about is it's very unfortunate that the primary mental model people have for crypto is it is a list of assets, some of which are worth more than others, and some of which have higher market caps than others. That is
Right.
probably 95% of all people who know anything about crypto. That is when they think of it, that's what they picture. There's Bitcoin at the top, then there's Ethereum, then there's a bunch of other stuff, and the prices go up and down. That, I understand why that happened. It happened because, of course, the first use case that really had any success was trading these assets, watching the price go up and down, believing in the story that, one of the things on this list is going to go up higher than the rest, and then one of the things on this is going down lower than the rest. But it is an extremely tiny view of this larger thing. One, I would love to kind of, shift people into seeing this not as just a list of assets, but as a system of interconnected domains, right? If you actually try to picture, I think, a more accurate picture of what the crypto ecosystem looks like, picture a bunch of spheres, and there's connections between them where there are bridges that allow users to move assets and activity between them. Some of them are connected to each other by virtue of being a layer 2 in the sense of they're, boring the security of the big, purple Ethereum sphere. And if you look at things that way, I mean, this is maybe biased from my perspective, but if you look at things that way, it becomes clear that Ethereum is the ecosystem. Right, there's two very large circles. One's Ethereum with all of its other ERC20s and NFTs and assets on it. The other is Bitcoin. But all of the bridges that connect all of these different things and the diversity of assets that people are playing with and experimenting and building, it's all either happening on Ethereum or it's deeply connected to it. But people, there's that visual metaphor doesn't exist yet. People still mostly view it just like it's a stock market, because we haven't, I think, really been able to explain this properly yet. And not because people aren't trying. I just mean that, we should, probably we both heard the phrase a lot over the years that the solution needs to be as big as the problem. And I think right now we're not reckoning with how big a problem this is.
Yeah, totally. Maybe this is a good transition point to this blog post that you wrote, right? Adam's Institutions Blockchains, which kind of, I mean, part of its purpose is it's like your take on why any of this matters, right? Like, I think it goes to the heart of this question of why these systems need to be decentralized and why that's a critical property of theirs that like everyone needs to understand. It's not just an accidental side effect or like a side property. So how would you lay out the thesis of this piece and what you're saying in there?
Yeah, I guess working the space for a while now, and I've seen, multiple waves of people like come in with all their bright-eyed enthusiasm and be, a really active part of the space, and then burn out and get discouraged and leave. And there have definitely been periods where I've felt that way too. It can be a lot. There's a lot of bullshit that happens in this industry, and it can definitely be demoralizing. And I started thinking about writing this and kind of sketching it out as kind of a response to those feelings of, I need to be able to articulate for myself, I guess, the kind of things that I intuitively feel but can't quite name yet. And I really wanted to be able to put something down on paper that I can look at and say, yes, okay, this is why I'm here. This is why this is worth, spending my life working on. So that was kind of the starting point.
Yeah, I hadn't connected those dots, but it's really cool that's like, in some ways this piece can act as that item for you.
Yeah, even if no one else cares about it, it was, and it continues to be helpful and clarifying for me. So I guess, and as you try to answer that question, it becomes complicated fast. You can tell a story about why an individual application like Bitcoin or like, an NFT or Uniswap matters, but that's not satisfying because it's just about these individual things. So, then you try to answer, okay, why does this thing of a blockchain matter? Or these broader narratives of like DeFi or the creator economy or seizure resistant money, these kind of broader stories. But of course there's this bigger picture, which is these blockchains enable all these things. Even things that seem pretty unrelated at first glance are all enabled by this thing, what we call a blockchain. And so it felt obvious to me that we're really only scratching the edges of understanding this, massive thing. There's this classic story of the blind men and the elephants, and I'm sure everyone's heard it, but briefly, three blind men who have never seen an elephant encounter an elephant. One touches the trunk and says, this is a rope for climbing. Another touches the ear and says, this is a beautiful carpet that I would lay down in my house. The other, touches one of the elephant's legs and says, "No, you fools, this is a tree." And of course, they're all wrong because they can't see the bigger picture. And I think DeFi, Web3, smart contracts, hard money, NFTs, these are all just good blind man stories about a part of the elephant, and there's nothing wrong with that. You need to be able to explain these things well to get people to care about the applications. But I think they're all of the type of I've counted the number of wrinkles on the trunk, and I can observe that there's, air going in and out of it. And I can even though I'm blind, I can give you a very accurate, compelling story about what this thing is. But they're not the big picture, right? They're not the highest level view. And I guess to make this even more complicated, the problem is not even explaining this one elephant that these blind men are touching. It is to realize that there are other elephants out there too, and that we need to not only explain this one elephant, but what is the species of elephant and how do all these elephants relate to one another. So that's getting kind of abstract, but the point is, I think that we really need to step quite far back to really understand what's going on.
And by other elephants here, you're not referring to other blockchains or anything like that. It's other just things in the world, which you'll get to, that give us the same properties that blockchains do at a base level.
Yeah, exactly. So getting to the actual thesis, I think the really simple narrative way to explain this is as follows. We can observe throughout human civilization that there are these tools or systems or applications that we use to coordinate with each other. So money is one of those systems in all its varieties. Financial systems, contracts, law of all kinds, various forms of governance and collective decision making. All of these, tools, applications, whatever, have something in common, which is that they require the ability to make specific things very certain in the future. Now, that probably sounds obvious, but here's some examples, right? So a contract, what distinguishes and is important about our ability to enter contracts with one another is that, we've built these complex institutions over millennia of, lawyers and judges and police forces. And the product of that is that in certain nations, we can go to each other, and if we, say certain words to each other and tick certain boxes, all those institutions will make it very, very likely that in the future, the contract will be enforced. And that is the point of this. That is what distinguishes, a contract from a mere promise, is that we've built all this infrastructure to make it very, very likely in the future that a certain thing will or won't happen. Another example might be gold, right? Gold is useful as a money, as a store of value. And one of the reasons for that is that we have, a pretty high degree of certainty about what the future supply of gold will be, right? Gold would not be a very good money or store of value if we had absolutely zero idea what the supply of gold was going to be in 1 year or 5 years or 10 years. But because we know that there's, really only a certain amount literally physically in the earth, and our technology can only access a certain portion of it, that, it's pretty predictable. Like we've, it just is relatively certain, or very certain in the future, that gold will have a certain supply.
Mm.
And so all these things rely on, some ability of human beings to just make the future more certain, or past a certain level of certainty that, it's good enough for the specific thing we're thinking of. Obviously,
Right.
neither of those examples I gave are absolute certainties. Contracts can be broken, police officials can be corrupted, an asteroid full of gold could hit the Earth tomorrow. But they've passed this like minimum bar of certainty for us to be able to rely on them. So all these things rely on this property. And so the answer to what blockchains are is extremely simple. They're just a new way of creating this certainty about the future. And in the blog post, I used the term hardness, that the special property that blockchains provide, and that other sources provide as well, is this property of hardness, that we can make claims about the future, we can harden them, we can make them very likely to obtain to be true in the future. And once you kind of have this insight and look at all these different sets of things that are out there in the world, you can see that there seem to really only be three sources of hardness. One is this new one, blockchains, that we've recently invented and, have proven them that they can enable money, enable, complex semi-contractual relationships, etc. The second is institutions, right? Like we create these, collections of people who behave in certain ways, and that includes, all legal systems, corporations that enforce various rules, complex financial institutions, governments, etc. Then the third one is, physical reality itself, which, I use atoms as a shorthand. And that is, part of what makes gold certain in the future. We didn't have to create an institution to control gold supply. We just happen to live in a universe where the rock that we're on has a certain amount of gold in it, and we've just kind of picked up on that, naturally occurring fact and built a social system around it.
Mm.
So to come back to the elephant metaphor, we're exploring this one elephant that is blockchains, and the different parts of it are these applications. But then, we realize that we've also been kind of, muddling along with these other elephants, one being institutions, and, all these other kind of pieces of it are just part of that. And another elephant is, the physical universe. And what all these things have in common is that they're just ways that human beings make the future more certain. And turns out that's, a fundamental piece of all these applications, tools, and systems that we use to coordinate.
Yeah. So they're basically, they give you an ability to design a new like physics almost, that of these properties that will hold through time in the future with some level of certainty. I'm curious, like taking this lens on the world and what we're doing, like are there types of things that blockchains can bring hardness to that atoms and institutions can't? Or like, does this help us kind of figure out where in this landscape of like possibilities to focus our energies?
One thing this unlocks is, and maybe this is kind of more getting to the political part of all this, is that once you understand that like there are these big things that we use to build these coordination tools, you realize that we should have opinions about which ones we're using and why and for what. And we should pay attention to when some system that we used to use that maybe at one point was guaranteed by atom hardness starts being guaranteed by institutional hardness. We should care about that change. Basically, that like to go to another metaphor, these are kind of like the materials, like the physical stuff that we build our civilizational infrastructure out of. And an architect has to care not only about the design of the house, but also what materials are used for what parts of it. There are things that you should not use drywall for. You wouldn't use drywall for load bearing, but drywall is fine to finish a wall and put a shelf into if it, is not holding more than maybe 15 pounds. Don't take that advice, by the way, if you're installing shelves. I just picked up a number out of my head. So we have to care about the materials we're using here, right? And I think one kind of major thing that blockchains contribute to the world is that they enable us to ask these questions, right? I think one success story for Bitcoin is that it has earnestly encouraged people to ask critical questions about different monetary systems. And whether you agree with a certain criticism of a certain central bank or not, it's probably good that people, understand a bit more about where money comes from and who it gives power to and who, at the end of the day, controls it. It's not just a naturally occurring feature of our environment. It is something that we built and that we choose to use, and it's possible to choose something differently. And that's the kind of, thing that Bitcoin has helped people understand. And I think the much larger picture is that all of this, meaning, crypto blockchains, is going to let people see that all sorts of the civilizational infrastructure we have around us, it's a choice to build it out of institutions. And it is a choice to enable those institutions to have certain kinds of power, maybe was the wrong choice. And, it's not inevitable. Money, law, systems, all these things we use to coordinate with each other and to build together and to, attempt to flourish. There's other ways of doing them too.
One thing is like this feels like quite elemental, right? It feels very core to what just humans on this planet are, right? Or like what we're trying to do, which is basically being able to know things will stay true through time, like being able to impose some structure on the universe as it progresses through time, right? That is what we're doing here. And I mean, in some ways, it's applied to the realm of like human beings and, intersubjective reality in some ways.
Yeah, I genuinely believe that we don't understand these most basic parts of, our societies. We tell stories about them, but I think we genuinely don't understand like what they are and what kind of category they fit into. One kind of like analogy that I, use in the blog post I think is helpful is today, the idea of information, abstract data of any type, ranging from the GCAT in your DNA, in your cells right now, to, this book on my desk, to what's being used to have this conversation right now. It's all just information. That's an extremely recent idea, right? It was not until really, the early 50s and 60s that this idea of information as this kind of universal thing that, helped explain everything from language to music to, the nature of biology to, waves and patterns in radio, like that idea did not exist before a certain point. And today it seems just absolutely fundamental to us. Like anyone would understand that. It's primal for the way that we look at the world today. And I really think that there's an analogous thing happening here, that only because we have this new technology that is, surprisingly enabling money and markets and complex, like pseudo-legal relationships that have this characteristic durability that we only thought was really possible by creating institutions of people to do things. Because we have this new technology, we're able to see that there is some underlying thing. Right? If a blockchain really can do what an institution can do, and that is just, an objective fact at this point, because we can look at how people behave and they actually do treat these things with value and use them as currency. Because blockchain institutions can both do that thing, like there must be something underlying them. Like there must be something that they both share, that they both have the capacity to do. And I think that thing is hardness. It is this idea of this kind of uniform concept of making the future more stable or more predictable in some certain way.
Right.
So I think because we've gone through, these previous momentous shifts in how we perceive the world, gives me some confidence that, when things don't make sense, it might just be that we're missing something pretty fundamental that we haven't thought to point out yet.
Yeah. That's super interesting. So hardness is a fundamental concept that enables us to understand things in a new way. And it's referring to this ability to basically create some like reliabilities through time, like know that the state of affairs, the state of things will hold true to some equation as time progresses. And that's like the fundamental thing that we're pointing to here.
Yeah, yeah.
Do you think that belief systems or memes in the more kind of in the deeper sense of the word, like basically idea packets that take hold and replicate and influence how people behave, like are they also a source of hardness, and are they distinct from these other three? Like how would you, for instance, like think about the idea of a religion, right? Because if someone believes a certain like religious doctrine, that means that they will behave a certain way in the future in a reliable way. And if a group of people believe those same things, then you can also say something about how they'll behave as a group.
Right. I would say no. So I guess an important clarification is that the universe of hardness and the things that we build out of atoms and institutions and blockchains are not the totality of all things that influence human behavior, right? There are many, many things that influence human behavior that I think has very little to do with this idea of hardness, right? And I think that like, culture, religion, social expectations, various kinds of social relationships are all kind of outside of it. And I guess the distinction to be drawn there is that key to hardness is that it is very specifically customizable, right? That, you and I can write basically whatever we want down in a contract, and the legal system will enforce the specific thing that we've agreed to.
Right.
That can be a number, that is written down, or like very specific performance of some obligation. And of course, there's boundaries on that depending on legislation, but let's ignore those details for now. So it's specific. And similarly, like a blockchain lets you have, this person has this account balance and this person has this account balance, and here's some specific code that's going to run, et cetera, et cetera. And even, atom-based stuff that's specific too. If I have an amount of gold sitting on my desk, I have that amount of gold sitting on my desk. It's not vague. The cultural stuff that influences human behavior, to generalize, is a little more kind of vague.
It's fuzzier.
It wouldn't be. Yeah, it's fuzzier, and it's not like a thing that an individual can necessarily influence. You and I could not, if we wanted to have some sort of commercial relationship, we couldn't go to our community and say, all right, look, everybody, we want to establish like a new cultural norm that if by June 23rd, 2027, Cena
Right.
owes Josh this much money and this much interest. People are going to say like, I don't care about that. Why don't you go write that down? At which point there's a separate kind of system for it. So even though culture can be very powerful in terms of motivating what people choose to do with their time and what they care about and what they don't, and what they will fight for, it's just a different kind of thing. It's like a mass
it has softer edges. It's like, it gives you a directional sense of what things in the future might be like, but it doesn't give you the same level of granularity, both either in the sense of like time. It's kind of interesting, like bringing this lens to Ethereum, right? It's like a kind of tagline could be like Turing complete hardness, right? Because it basically lets you define anything that can be expressed, in a program. And it also has this notion of time progressing in the future. So you can literally describe anything whatsoever. So I guess where the limits of this source of hardness is power, right? Like the things that even Ethereum has a hard time bringing hardness to feel like the sorts of things that one maybe can't be defined as precisely, right? Anything that can't be made quantitative in the same ways, because you can't just express it in the lines of a program. And two, maybe the types of things that the thing you're trying to make the claim on requires like human level judgment, right? Like it's not something that can be objectively adjudicated. I guess they're not different in that way from, say, the institution of law, right? Because like it's not like the legal system is this just thing that executes every case absolutely with some mathematical formula. It relies on human beings, which are like imprecise and take in all this complexity and make sense out of it to like enforce its hardness. But
Yeah,
I
there's
guess
certainly
those
been
are
kind
two
of
things that
different,
come to mind.
a lot has been made of smart contracts aren't legal contracts, and of course by now we all understand that and should have always. I guess the correct perspective is that legal contracts and smart contracts are both things in a larger category that you might kind
Right.
of say is like programmable hardness. One is programmable in the sense that we are writing down instructions in specialized but human language, which is then interpreted and acted upon by human beings. The other is programmable in the sense of a extremely constrained digital software environment that can do anything within a kind of certain set of parameters, but doesn't have any physical influence on our world. And yeah, like they're just different things. I guess one way that this perspective helps is that it really just takes the magic and mystery out of all this. These are just things that have certain properties that are good at some things, but bad at others, right?
Right.
So institutions are, very useful. The story of human civilization is in large part a story of us building better and better institutions that are capable of, coordinating a global spacefaring civilization. They're good at lots of things. One thing that they're good at is, there's a lot of complexity to our world, and things frequently require some amount of human interpretation. Judgment has to be made. That is a way that institutions are useful. Another is that, they tend to be perceived as more legitimate when there are, people making these decisions. When you can point at a building full of people who are part of your community, it is easier for people to have kind of confidence and trust in that building full of fleshy humans just like them, because we're just inclined to think that way. Blockchains, on the other hand, they don't have either of those virtues. But one thing that's great about them is that they're extraordinarily accessible, right? It is not the case that anybody can just go and make an institution or go and
Right.
convince any institution to, give hardness to a specific thing. But it is the case that anybody, anywhere in the world with interconnection and a basic amount of programming ability can, use Ethereum to make something hard, whether that be a new automated market DEX, or an NFT or something else that we haven't seen yet. It has this kind of complete and cheap accessibility to the global population. It also is natively digital, right? I think like one kind of mega trend kind of under the surface here is that the way that I graphed like the kind of Web3 story onto Atom's institutions blockchains is that we are kind of trying to create like a digital global civilization, in the sense that we now have this expectation that it shouldn't really matter where you're born. We're all together on the internet. We can all communicate with each other. We should be able to do business with each other. We should be able to, hire somebody from around the world, to send them money, to collaborate, to coordinate with them. We are trying to do that because it's just a natural thing now that we have this incredible toolkit, called the internet. But the world isn't really kind of built that way. These systems that enable, real coordination, meaning the systems that enable hardness and thus allow for money, finance, law, government, all these things, are still very much grounded entirely in institutions. And institutions, for the most part, are entirely grounded into specific nation states and jurisdictions. They can't really just cross borders as easily as we tend to want them to. And so the thing that is really happening under the surface of Web3 is that blockchains solve that problem. We are able to have a source of hardness that is already natively in this digital environment and is thus natively global. Anybody can use Bitcoin. Anybody can use Ethereum. You don't have to ask for someone's permission or go through, through the lottery of birth, whatever restrictions are placed in your way by, the government, good or bad, that controls your life. And that's really what's kind of happening here. And that's, one of the big things that blockchains enable that nothing else could do prior.
Yeah, it's super, super powerful. I mean, another thing that's true about blockchains as a source of hardness is that there's kind of a closed loop between these different systems if they're blockchain native, right? So the hardness will automatically be enforced without there needing to be any interfaces. Like it's like atomic hardness, right? It just like happens because both of these things are smart contracts run on Ethereum, and their physics of them are tied into each other. So how do you feel about this kind of analysis after the fact? Do you feel like you've hit an adequate answer to what's going on here? Or how do you feel in this quest for understanding what's going on?
Yeah, I mean, this in the long term, I think that this is, going to help explain what's about to happen. It's going to kind of help explain what, sort of applications we might see, and how people will eventually start to think about the relationships between these things, right? I think the end state, like the view from the future where I'm trying to, sit and look backwards, is that institutions, atoms, and blockchains are viewed as just component infrastructure, and that we choose what to use in different cases, right? We become aware as a society, as a civilization, that there are risks to using institutions as your source of hardness. The obvious ones being that it places individual people who are fallible, corruptible, evil, racist, sexist, whatever, in a significant position of power where those things can be abused, and where they are abused, right? I think one natural thing that institutions do is they're always in this mode of convincing people that people should trust them.
They're trustworthy. Right.
Yeah. And that's kind of a necessary greasing of the wheel, maybe, for these institutions to work at scale. But it's always been true that institutions don't serve everybody equally, right? And this is kind of a thing that unifies a lot of political trends around the world, given from multiple different, political vantage points, that institutions treat some people differently than others. And they always have, and they always will. Institutions that are tied to profit motives are always going to have dual loyalties in some sense of, the people that rely on them want them to be a stable source of hardness, among other things, but people that might be in control of the ship want that institution to do something else, to make money in a certain way, to pursue a different business model, to turn off the open API and invalidate all the startups that have been building on it, that kind of thing. And so I think we're going to reach a point where we're able to make these choices and say that, well, maybe in this case, it actually makes a lot more sense to use a blockchain as the underlying source of hardness, for example, global finance, or for the base authentication layer for a digital identity, because these things are just better up to the task. And we will still, of course, have institutions. They're not going anywhere. We will still have legal systems. They are a critical part of our civilization. But we will use both in different ways at different moments, and they will work together. They will be kind of hybrid to some extent. I mean, this is already true, right? In the sense of the way that most people experience cryptocurrency is, they might have a non-custodial wallet, but they might occasionally use an application that is a little bit less decentralized. They occasionally use an exchange that is, very similar to a bank in some ways of its trust model, but they're moving between these things as they need to. And obviously, I believe that we're tilted a little or much too far in the direction of relying on institutions right now, but they will always kind of both be part of the picture.
Right. This lens also helps explain why decentralization, right, and the robustness of these systems is actually super important, right? Like it determines the degree to which they can be a source of hardness, right? If the system is unreliable, is like going to change under your feet, that reduces its ability to impose hardness on the world. And that's the whole point of these things. So that's like a pretty helpful lens, because I think there's other properties that blockchains can give you without the hardness, right? You can sacrifice some level of decentralization and still maintain the fact that this is a global, interoperable ledger that just, executes these programs. But like if you lose that ability to be a source of hardness in a super reliable way, over a timeline of decades and centuries, you just fundamentally like limit what can be built using this thing in a very important way.
Yeah, exactly. The base layer needs to be as secure as possible, and people will make deviations from that, in some cases, but you can't build a more hard system on a very weak foundation. The foundation needs to be as hard as possible, or enable that, and then people can
Right.
kind of make their own choices on top of it. And again, this kind of comes back to why it's so important for people to understand what's going on behind the scenes. That if people don't understand the differences between the guarantee that they care about being hard because of an institution or being hard because of a blockchain, then they can't make an informed choice, right? They need to understand that here are the
Right.
risks with one, and here are the risks with another. And right now, like, we're just not able to have an informed and honest conversation about that, right? Institutions, people, it can be hard to predict risks. There's a confusing political component of that, of what institutions you trust and don't trust. It can be very partisan in some countries. People don't understand what the hell this blockchain thing is, and why it's trustworthy or not. So we're not anywhere close to individual human beings being able to think about and make an informed choice to vote with their feet and what they want to use in different cases. And it's going to take a long time for us to get there.
Yeah.
People can make pretty informed decisions today about which cell phone provider to use, or which internet plan, or what material they should build their house out of. And we need to get there with this much broader concern of what our civilization is built out of as well.
Totally. So next time someone asks me to explain Ethereum at a dinner party, I'm gonna be like, well, let me explain hardness to you. It's a new
Yeah.
pathway for me. I don't need to
See you in
start
an
from.
hour. Yeah.
Yeah. I do think it's an interesting lens. I've never taken this path for explaining what all of this is, but I think it does hit on like the most important notes of why all of this matters.
Yeah. It's not, it's not the total story. To me, it's kind of like the enabling thing. And then there's a lot more you got to say about it.
Totally. There's a lot of texture on top of it.
Another kind of way that I started thinking about this, and a way that maybe helps motivate it, is that we always talk about the way that blockchains are different from institutions, right? We're able to say, like, oh, well, one is decentralized and the other is centralized, but there is not a good story about how they're the same, right? And people just kind of treat that as like, it's not even really a question that needs to be answered. But given that both of these things can produce a money, and both of them are already used and relied upon by people, there must be some story we can tell about what these things have in common. And I think that's a really important like switch we need to make of, it's not enough to say that this is different from institutions. This is different from fiat banking. This is different from a bank. This is different from whatever. We need to be able to say, like, well, the things you do like about banks and fiat money, that it is reliable. We can explain to you why this is equivalent or better in certain scenarios. And just talking about decentralization, talking about the opposite, talking about the difference, I think is not enough to really explain to people what's going on here, and whether it might be a valuable thing for them.
Totally. So I know we've been talking for a while. There is one more area that I was maybe interested in talking about. When I look at the EF is not organized in a traditionally, hierarchical way. And then on the other end of the spectrum, it's like a fully traditional team with a manager who has, who, I don't know, sets a roadmap, has one-on-ones with their team, runs like compensation reviews, like all these sorts of things. And I'm curious, what have you learned about that?
I guess so. To break it down a little bit, again, I think that a general principle and something that I think is very key to how the EF thinks about itself structurally is that small teams of people can get a lot done. And what the EF tends to be is a community of relatively small teams that have a lot of, kind of independence and ownership over what they do. And different teams, within the EF work quite differently. Some are more structured than others. Some might, resemble a bit more of a like kind of traditional product team that have a certain stand-up schedule and sprints and reviews and so forth. And there's a team lead who facilitates and kind of manages that. And then there are teams that want to be or need to be less structured. That might be, a bit more in the direction of kind of open exploration and research, and might just end up spending most of their time even working with people outside the EF more than they work with other teams inside the EF, because they're plugged into this kind of broader distributed R&D community around the world that is the kind of broader Ethereum technical community. So there's no like one size fits all answer, right? The direction that we've chosen to go is, we're not trying to be this like kind of consistent hegemonic organization where there are standards for everything and teams need to kind of fall into place within this structure. Rather, we try and kind of let teams lead in the sense of teams determine for themselves what works for them. And there's obvious downsides to that. Less kind of consistency and structure can be great for some teams and hard for others. It can be great for some personalities, but not for others. Some people really like structure, and there's nothing necessarily wrong with that. It's just not the choice that we've made, and it's not the choice that's right for our strategic environment. So that's part of an answer. So I guess part of what I've learned and what informs how I think about things is just really kind of learning from the EF and learning from the team leads and the people who work here and who have figured out what works for them, and then based on that trying to support where needed, right? One kind of form of that, or I guess like a form of management that I try and provide to teams and team leads is not to say that things need to be done a certain way, but to provide options and resources that, if a team wants to kind of know off the shelf, what are the best practices for X, Y, Z, then, we can help inform that and give feedback on different options, connect them to the people who can answer those questions rather than, kind of top down say how it has to be.
Like an example here would be if you're trying to do some recruiting, right? Like each team can run its totally independent recruiting process, but if they want, there are central resources they can plug into.
Exactly. Yeah. So if a team has a strong opinion about the right way to do hiring for them, teams can run with that process. If they want to kind of plug into a more kind of off the shelf set of resources that the EF operational side provides, then that's available too. So I think that's one kind of key thing, and it's not too revolutionary. It's pretty obvious kind of in our environment, but it does work. The downside, part of the downside is that it makes it harder for people in operational or more like the kind of central management positions, right? One reason that organizations that are centralized tend to end up being rigid is because the people that are in charge, decision makers, CEO, whatever, they want to make it as easy as possible for them to make sense of what the organization is doing and to be able to react and control it, to be able to pass down priorities from the CEO's office down to every person working in that organization. if you want to have the ability to do that, you do, need a kind of like centralized, very rigid, well-defined process that, where priorities kind of roll down into other teams. But that's, not the way that we operate. It is, not possible, and it is not the goal for, the people that serve as leadership at the EF to understand every part of, what every team should be doing. Teams inform their own roadmaps. They are either the experts in their domains, and they work with the ecosystem and with the kind of, sub communities that they're part of within this broader Ethereum community, to figure out what matters the most. And there's some like kind of soft level of, here are some things that are important. We might, create a new team or encourage a team to kind of look at something. But again, it's very team driven. So that's maybe kind of the key thing. This also means that, there's a pretty wide variety of experiences of what it's like to work at the EF, because it really kind of depends what team you're on. Some teams, again, more structured, other teams less structured. Some people who end up the EF, might kind of be between teams a little bit, or they might kind of spin out into another project. And that amount of freedom and like the ability to be entrepreneurial and to kind of create your own job, that can be an amazing thing for some people who really want that. And it can be scary or paralyzing or just not the right fit for others. So you have to kind of want to work a certain way, I think, to be successful in this kind of freewheeling thing. Although, again, there's a variety of experiences on different teams to EF.
Yeah, totally. I also find that it's interesting how this style of organizing extends beyond the boundaries of the EF, right? So that like, I don't even necessarily look at the EF as an organization that has a clear inside and outside, and this comes to mind when people, used to ask me like, how many people work at the EF? And it's a really difficult question to answer if you're trying to do it well, because there are certain people who are, on full-time contractors with the EF. But then there's this like other layer of folks who are grantees, right? And they're grantees who set their own directions, like come with proposals with a budget, and maybe 100% of their annual kind of budget is coming from a grant from the EF. And so functionally speaking, what is the difference between an external team that's a grantee in this way and quote unquote internal team that has a budget from the EF? And I think it's super interesting that the org operates in this way.
Yeah, it's a very fuzzy boundary, right? And it doesn't need to be a hard boundary. I guess like one kind of helpful visual metaphor maybe is, picture you're high above the air in a jet, and you're looking down, and there's, a network of interconnected towns, and there's, houses that are kind of deep right in the middle of a town, and there are houses that are kind of more on the edge, so much so that they might seem like they're kind of part of two different communities. And this is kind of how the EF is, right? We're kind of a small town within a much larger network of communities and cities and regions and economies. And some people are kind of on the outskirts because that's where they want to live, and other people want to spend more time, closer to kind of other teams. And people kind of come in and come out. It is at the end of the day, again, a community, I think, is the best way of thinking about it. A community within, and alongside many other communities, as opposed to a company or an organization or an institution.
Yeah, and that has its strengths and its challenges, right? Of like then, people from the outside, especially people who aren't even in the crypto ecosystem, right? Like some external org could look at the Ethereum Foundation and think it's this, uniform thing that they're talking to. But meanwhile, on the inside, there's just like many different moving pieces that aren't necessarily like being coordinated from a central place.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. A lot of people are intrigued by the EF, but don't really know that much about what it's like to work there. So I'm curious, like, do you have a way to paint a picture of that for people?
Yeah, I mean, it's there's a lot of variety, but I can tell you, I guess what I love about it, and
Mm.
what I understand to be some of the commonalities that I've talked about with other people, or I've heard them say. From my perspective, again, kind of going back to where we started, it is just the place that is one of the places, or maybe the place that is thinking the most about the big picture, and is kind of encouraged to think in the long term. And those are really kind of the questions and challenges that I think are most exciting to me. The thing that motivates me is not only the impact, but the kind of the depth of the challenge. And
Yeah.
it doesn't get much bigger than I think the kind of things that we get to think about, and the kind of things that the teams at the EF that I'm privileged to be able to work with and to support and try and make their lives easier. The things that they contribute to are very, very big. Another is that I think this is probably common across many crypto organizations, but there is a real sense of mission, right?
Mm.
People work at the EF because they care about it, right? People are not here to pad their resume, or because there's a well-worn path already on some career trajectory. People are here because they believe, in the mission of what we're doing, and they want to see it head in a good direction, and they want to be part of it. And that is something that I don't want to ever take for granted. I guess the other way of putting it is, the org, I think, has chosen very intentionally to allow for kind of natural adjustments and growth and shifting. A lot of the teams that are part of the EF are spinouts of other teams, where there was some new need that was developed and someone thought, you know what, I should really work on that. And, pitched this to somebody, got feedback on it, got funding for it, and is now a team, working on some discrete area of concern or some discrete problem. And that kind of ability of where you start out might not necessarily be what you're working on in 6 months or a year. And
Yeah.
that kind of ability to again, create your own job, I think is really compelling to some people, in that you're not constrained by the box the organization puts you in many ways. Again, the teams lead where they want to go, and the broader EF is there to kind of like support and make the big picture decisions.
Totally. At least while I was fully working at the EF, you very intentionally didn't have titles in the org, right? And I think part of the reason was to let this level of flexibility and adaptability exist, right? Of like,
Yeah, exactly.
you can just like very fluidly move around, work on other problems. And I think that's just a very cool thing to be a part of.
Yeah. Yeah, titles clarify, but titles also constrain. If someone sees themselves as their title, that this
Right.
is my status, it is my social signifier within this organization, within this community, then starting to work on a new problem, even if it's what you want to do, means maybe giving up the title. Maybe you like the title for reasons that are entirely independent of its purpose and explaining to others what you do. So,
Right.
having the freedom of like, you're not your title, you are a person, and you have a set of things that you're working on, and you have some conviction in those things, means that what you're working on can change. And if someone wants to know, like, what your job is, they can ask you, and then you can explain in a few sentences, and that'll give 100 times as much information and as much true information as just, seeing someone's title on a card in the or chat or something.
I may be paraphrasing, but I remember a conversation with some time ago about titles, and she quoted this line from Finite and Infinite Games, where it says finite players have titles or seek titles or something like that, and infinite players have nothing but their names. And I
Yeah.
think there's just something so beautiful in that, where ultimately, if you have nothing but your name, then you're totally unique, right? You're freed to kind of really carve your own path, and you're not slotting into this like existing machinery that it's like a lower resolution representation of who you are. And if you have nothing but your name, you just do what you care about. It frees you to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. To connect this back to another thing we talked about earlier, that it's pretty common at a early stage startup or a small team that there might not be titles in that environment too, right? Everyone just kind of knows each other well enough to know what they're working on. And you don't need titles at that point. Titles are kind of they're a solution to a problem of, getting past the Dunbar number to some extent,
Right.
where, you need some other mechanism to help people understand what others do. And I think that, by virtue of being really a collection of small but highly effective teams, we're freed a little bit. And not having titles also kind of, I guess, encourages people to think in those terms, as opposed to seeing themselves as part of some monolithic larger structure.
Totally. All right. How do you feel about if we call it here?
Yeah, all good.
Fun.
We'll see how I feel when I hear the recording. I'm totally fine, but
yeah.